The millionaire returned home earlier than expected, and upon opening the heavy oak door, he froze. There, under the dim light of the foyer, his little daughter was kneeling on the cold tiles, with reddened and trembling hands, her dress torn and stained with tears and dust. That single image shattered the elegant facade of the mansion, exposing a cruel truth. Hidden threats and a ruthless plan woven by those closest to him had turned his home into a prison for an innocent girl. If you appreciate stories that speak of second chances, of the strength of family, and of the courage to do what's right, this story will stay with you long after it ends. Join the journey of a girl who dared to whisper the truth, and of a father who finally decided to listen. In the silent mansion outside Boston, autumn light filtered through the tall windows and fell on the marble floor, where little Isabella knelt with an old rag in her hands. The pink and blue dress she wore, inherited from her mother, was worn and damp. Ice-cold water spread in puddles that reflected the ceiling lamp, and each movement of the girl left behind a red mark on the fabric, for her fingers were cracked and bleeding. The air smelled of wax and spilled wine, as if the grandeur of the house hid an invisible wound. In a corner still hung the portrait of Lucia, the deceased mother with her serene smile, like a ghost silently observing the scene. Camilla, in her fitted red dress and a pearl necklace that had belonged to Lucia, stood with arms crossed, her lips painted a red too intense for the dim light. Her voice cut through the silence. "Harder, Isabella. That corner is still dirty. And don't forget to dry over there." Near the door, the girl raised her eyes for an instant, trying to catch her breath. Her breathing broke. "Please, let me rest for a moment. My hands can't take it anymore." Camilla frowned, leaned down, and with an abrupt movement knocked over the bucket of water onto the floor. The water splashed the girl's knees and she shuddered. "Tired? That means you have to scrub harder. And remember what I told you. If you tell your father anything, your mother's ashes will end up in the street." Isabella pressed her lips together, containing a sob. Her mother's name was like a knife. Fear made her lower her head again and drag the rag across the tiles, while tears remained suspended on her eyelashes without falling. Outside, the wind dragged dry leaves against the mansion's stone walls. The afternoon turned to night, and the house, though full of luxuries, felt empty, as if the walls had absorbed all the joy along with Lucia's laughter. Isabella could barely move her arms. Each brush against the floor was torture. The silence was only broken by her short breaths and the squeak of the rag against the tile. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the atmosphere. The main lock turned, and the door slam echoed like thunder through the emptiness. The echo of Italian leather shoes striking the marble floor filled the foyer. Alejandro Herrera had just arrived earlier than expected, still wearing his gray suit and loosened tie after hours of meetings in the city. His imposing figure advanced a few steps, tired but elegant, and then stopped abruptly. Before him, under the dim living room light, his daughter was kneeling in the middle of a puddle with her soaked dress and reddened eyes. Isabella, surprised, dropped the rag from her wounded hands. Alejandro stood frozen, seeing his daughter kneeling in the middle of the puddle with red eyes. The echo of Alejandro's footsteps resonated on the marble as he walked toward the dining room. That sound, which had so many times marked his triumphant arrival after days of meetings, this time seemed hollow, almost painful. For the first time in a long while, he forced himself to look his daughter in the eyes. Isabella barely held his gaze with her own, reddened by exhaustion, and something inside him broke. In that flash, he recognized the promise he had made to Lucia in the hospital. The night when everything seemed lost. Never leave her alone. The phrase returned like a whiplash and accompanied him until he crossed the dining room threshold. The table was prepared with Camilla's usual care: white tablecloth, freshly baked bread still warm, black olives arranged in a clay bowl, a bottle of Napa Valley Red breathing in crystal glasses. Outside, the autumn wind beat forcefully against the shutters and dragged dry leaves across the stone patio. The house seemed intact in its luxury, but the air was charged with an uncomfortable silence. Isabella remained hunched at one end of the table with her back straight, as if afraid to move an inch too much. Camilla immediately stood up, her smile perfectly drawn. "It was just a small accident," she explained with rehearsed sweetness. "The girl spilled water, and I wanted to teach her to be more organized. You know, discipline in details builds character." Alejandro didn't respond. He approached the girl and took her hands in his. They were so small they fit entirely in his palm. But what stopped him were the red cracks on her knuckles, the skin cracked from cold water and constant friction. Isabella tried to pull her fingers back modestly, but he held them a few seconds longer. What happened here? His voice sounded low but loaded with gravity. Camilla raised her eyebrows, feigning surprise. She fell on the stairs. Children always get scratches, she said, shrugging her shoulders naturally. Isabella remained silent, barely moving her lips as if she wanted to speak, but was forbidden by something stronger than fear. Finally, she lowered her gaze toward the empty plate in front of her. Alejandro felt a knot in his throat, as if words were stuck. Dinner began under thick tension. The only sound was the clatter of silverware against china. Isabella barely tried the bread. When she attempted to raise the spoon, her hand trembled so much it seemed she would spill the broth. Alejandro, watching her, felt the wine taste like ash. Camilla filled the air with light conversation, talking about social commitments in the city, influential acquaintances, future trips. Alejandro responded with monosyllables, not really listening. His attention remained fixed on the girl, on her hands hidden under the table, on the way she avoided raising her gaze. Isabella barely swallowed a bite, as if each piece got stuck in her throat. The wall clock struck past 10, and the metallic sound of the chimes seemed to underline the girl's silence. Alejandro leaned toward her with a soft voice, but she immediately looked away like a frightened little bird. Camilla, with a courteous smile, insisted the girl eat a little more. She served her stew and placed it in front of her. Isabella raised the spoon with effort, held it for a few seconds, and then let it fall onto the plate with a weak tap. The girl took a deep breath, as if fighting against something invisible. And then her voice broke. "Dad, my hands can't take it anymore." The glass Alejandro was holding remained suspended in the air. The liquid swayed dangerously close to the edge without falling. The entire room seemed to stop. Camila remained motionless, feigning a smile while he felt his heart freeze. Alejandro remained motionless with the glass in his hand, feeling that something very dark was hiding in his own home. Dawn arrived with a faint glow filtering through the wooden shutters. Alejandro had barely slept. The image of Isabella with cracked hands and a broken voice had haunted him all night. He walked down the carpeted hallway, his steps muffled by the mansion's silence. His fingers stopped before a door that had been closed for too long. The doorknob was cold, and for a few seconds he hesitated to turn it. Finally, he inserted the key that had remained forgotten in his desk, and a dry creak announced its opening. The room still smelled of Lucia. It wasn't a strong scent, but a delicate trace of perfume mixed with dust and memories. The curtains remained drawn, letting in the golden morning light. On the dresser rested a carefully folded handkerchief, and next to it, a wooden box with a thin layer of dust. Alejandro opened it slowly. Inside, a yellowed envelope with Lucia's slanted handwriting. With trembling hands, he took it and sat on the bed. The letter said, "If I'm no longer here, take care of Isabella. Don't trust just anyone. Her eyes will show you the truth." The words, written in ink now somewhat faded, sounded like a living whisper in his mind. Alejandro pressed the paper against his chest. The memory of his wife's voice in the hospital returned with force, the promise he had made. Never leave her alone, which he had broken by taking refuge in work and silence. Thoughts crowded in like a torrent. He remembered the unjust doubts that had distanced him from the girl, rumors, insinuations from third parties. The fear of facing loneliness after Lucia's death had convinced him that Isabella was just a painful mirror of what was lost, when in reality, she was the only reason to keep standing. He stood up and walked to the unlit fireplace, where a family portrait still hung. Lucia smiled serenely, holding the newborn wrapped in a blanket. Beside her, he himself appeared with an expression of pride he barely remembered. A stab of shame pierced him. He had denied that part of his life for too long. A slight creak of the door interrupted his thoughts. Isabella appeared barefoot with a glass of water in her hands. She stood motionless upon seeing him, as if fearing she had intruded on a forbidden sanctuary. Alejandro said nothing, only observed her carefully. The girl, uncertain, advanced one step and extended the glass. "Here, Dad, I thought you were thirsty." He accepted it, and for the first time in a year, he dared to look at her directly. Isabella's large eyes shone with the same light as Lucia's in the portrait. There was no possible doubt. The same sparkle, the same the same depth. The silence between them was dense, but Alejandro felt something inside him crumble and at the same time rebuild. Isabella lowered her gaze, squeezing the glass between her hands. Alejandro took a deep breath with Lucia's letter still burning in his memory. In that instant, he knew the truth could no longer be ignored. He leaned forward with a barely audible murmur, as if it were an intimate oath. Today I will know the truth, even if it hurts. Rain pounded hard against the mansion's windows, filling the dining room with a constant murmur that seemed to accompany each held breath. On the long table, covered with a white tablecloth and adorned with crystal glasses, lay several documents that Camilla and Ricardo had spread out with a solemn gesture. The chandelier cast a warm glow, but the tension was so palpable that not even the light could soften the atmosphere. Alejandro remained upright in his chair with a serious face, silently observing the pages resting before him. "They're simple management papers," Ricardo explained in a persuasive voice, adjusting his tie knot. "If you sign them, brother, you'll be able to rest from so many responsibilities. We'll know how to take care of what has cost you so much effort." Camila intervened immediately, gently placing her hand on Alejandro's wrist, as if wanting to convey calm. "Think of Isabella," she whispered with rehearsed sweetness. "She needs a secure environment, someone to take care of the details while you regain peace. I always want what's best for her." Alejandro turned his gaze toward his daughter. Isabella was seated a few seats away, hunched over herself, with fingers nervously interlaced. She tried to go unnoticed, but her eyes followed every gesture of the conversation. Alejandro realized she was hiding something in her hands, a folded object she pressed against her lap, as if it gave her strength. Ricardo leaned forward, pushing one of the pages toward Alejandro. "Sign here," he said in a confident tone. "That way everything will be resolved and the family will rest." Camilla nodded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's best for everyone." The silence in the room became thick. The wall clock struck 9:30 with a dry chime, like a reminder that every minute counted. Alejandro took the pen, turned it between his fingers but didn't bring it close to the paper. His breathing was slow, heavy, as if carrying too large a burden. Then suddenly, Isabella moved clumsily, and something slipped from her skirt. An object fell on the table with an unexpected thud. It was an old photograph protected by a worn edge. Everyone looked at it. Alejandro was the first to recognize what he saw: Lucia, with her hair loose, holding a newborn in her arms. Beside her was himself, younger, with an expression of pride that hadn't reflected on his face in years. The image was so clear that for an instant, the present vanished, and he felt like that father again who believed he had disappeared. Camilla opened her eyes wide in surprise. Ricardo clenched his jaw, trying to regain control. Isabella lowered her head in shame. Her small hands trembled as she tried to recover the photo, but she couldn't. Alejandro took it first with tense fingers. The paper was thin but weighed like a stone on his chest. He looked at his daughter in silence. Isabella now watched him with a flushed face, lips parted, as if wanting to speak, but not daring. Her eyes, bright and moist, were identical to Lucia's in the photograph. Alejandro felt a strange vertigo, a recognition that pierced him without compassion. For an instant, all the noise of the rain disappeared. He squeezed the photo between his fingers, and with a barely audible murmur, pronounced the words that sealed the inevitable. "They're the same." Alejandro remained motionless with the photograph between his fingers, unable to take his eyes off Lucia's face smiling in that memory. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Camilla stood up quickly, trying to recover her firm tone. "Don't dramatize," she said coldly. "It's just an old photo. It means nothing." Ricardo seconded her, leaning forward with a calculated half-smile. "The past is past, brother. Here we're talking about the future. Sign and everything will be in order." But Alejandro no longer heard their words. The echo of Lucia's letter resonated in his mind again. "Trust only in your daughter's eyes." He slowly raised his gaze toward Isabella, who looked at him with contained trembling. In those eyes, he recognized the truth he had denied for too long. With an abrupt movement, he closed the document folder and pushed it aside. "This can wait," he said in a grave voice. "I won't sign anything until I review it with my lawyer." The silence was immediate. Camilla frowned and Ricardo pressed his lips in a gesture that revealed more than he would have wanted. Isabella, seated at the end, let out a small sigh of relief, though she immediately disguised it by lowering her head. Later that night, while the wind lashed the shutters, Alejandro walked the dark hallways of the mansion. He stopped before Isabella's bedroom door and listened. A muffled sob reached his ears. He knocked gently, and without waiting for a response, entered. The girl was sitting on the bed hugging a pillow with all her strength. "Why are you crying?" he asked in a low voice. Isabella looked at him with fear, as if still doubting whether she could speak. Finally, she whispered, "They have a plan. They say if I speak, they'll throw Mom's ashes in the street." Alejandro felt a cold fire run through his body. He approached and stroked her hair clumsily. "You'll never be alone again, I promise you." The next day, he decided to seek help. He met discreetly with Leon Garcia, the family's trusted lawyer, at a cafe near downtown. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and toast with butter filled the air, while the church bells marked noon. Alejandro, with a serious expression, handed him Lucia's letter and recounted the suspicions he had accumulated. Leon listened attentively, nodding without interrupting. "We can act," the lawyer finally said. "But we need proof. A recording. A testimony. Something a judge can't deny." Alejandro nodded with a furrowed brow. He knew this meant taking risks inside his own home, but there was no turning back. That afternoon, back at the mansion, he watched as Camilla spoke on the phone in a low voice in the office. Ricardo came and went naturally, as if he owned the place. Isabella, on the other hand, remained in the library leafing through a music notebook that had belonged to her mother. Alejandro approached slowly and surprised her clumsily drawing some notes on the blank page. "Mom taught me this song," she murmured, "but I forgot it." Alejandro swallowed hard, caressed the sheet music, and with a thread of voice hummed the first notes he still remembered. Isabella looked at him surprised, and for the first time in months, sketched a slight smile, fragile but genuine. That spark gave him strength. He decided to discreetly install, with the lawyer's help, a small recording device in the main living room. The device remained camouflaged as a smoke detector, invisible to those who didn't know it. While adjusting the final details, he heard Camilla's footsteps approaching. He hid the tension with a rehearsed smile and commented that he needed to review the house's security. She suspected nothing. That night, the tension reached its maximum point. During dinner, Isabella accidentally spilled some water. The glass rolled and fell to the floor with a crash. Camilla stood up abruptly with contained fury. "You're incapable of doing anything right," she spat in a low but sharp voice. Isabella shrank, and with a trembling voice let escape a whisper that pierced the room. "I have your eyes, Dad." Alejandro froze. The world stopped for an instant. The phrase resonated like thunder inside him, stronger than any proof. Alejandro remained seated with Isabella's phrase pounding in his chest like an echo impossible to silence. "I have your eyes, Dad." The certainty disarmed him because in those eyes he saw not only Lucia's reflection, but also the part of himself he had denied for too long. The girl, with her face flushed with fear, immediately lowered her gaze as if she had revealed a secret too big for her lips. Camilla, nervous, tried to deflect the tension. "Girl, don't talk nonsense. You don't understand what you're saying." But Alejandro no longer heard her. He extended his hand and caressed his daughter's hair with a tenderness he had forgotten. Isabella shuddered, first from surprise, then from relief. Ricardo, seeing that scene, shifted in his chair and muttered with irritation, "Don't waste time with sentimentality. What matters is what you sign." Alejandro looked up. The authority in his eyes was enough for silence to prevail. With a slow gesture, he pushed the papers aside and shoved them toward Ricardo. "I won't sign anything, and from today, the decisions about this house and about my daughter, I make alone." Rage appeared on Camilla and Ricardo's faces. She clenched her fists. He leaned forward as if wanting to protest. It was then that Alejandro stood up, went to the sideboard, and discreetly turned on the device Leon had provided. A metallic voice filled the room. The recording of Camilla threatening Isabella, her cruel phrase about Lucia's ashes. The words resonated between the walls like a whip. Isabella covered her ears, but Alejandro hugged her tight against his chest. The subsequent silence was broken by a knock on the door. Leon entered accompanied by a local judge and a police officer, all summoned in advance. Ricardo paled. Camilla stammered an excuse, but the judge raised a document, a restraining order to protect the girl and freeze any suspicious movement regarding the family fortune. The confrontation was inevitable. Ricardo protested, but the officer stopped him calmly. Camilla tried to maintain composure but ended up removed from the dining room amid tears of rage. Isabella, still trembling, clung to her father's jacket as if it were a lifeline. Alejandro, with a serious face, thanked the judge and Leon with a handshake. For the first time in a long while, he felt he had fulfilled his promise to Lucia. The following days were a whirlwind. Legal procedures, statements, and news that spread through the area. But inside the mansion, the routine began to change. Isabella no longer slept with the door closed. Sometimes she left it ajar, as if wanting to make sure her father's presence wouldn't disappear. Alejandro spent more time at home preparing simple snacks for her. Toast with butter, hot chocolate in winter. Little by little, the mansion's silence filled with everyday sounds. The piano playing again, the girls' timid laughter, shared footsteps in the courtyard. October arrived, and with it the autumn festival. The town square lit up with colored garlands, stalls selling candy and funnel cakes, the smell of cinnamon and mulled cider. Alejandro held Isabella's hand through the crowd. The girl looked fascinated at the lanterns and parades, the church bells resonating over the cobblestone streets. Passing by a stall, an elderly woman offered them apple pie. Isabella accepted a piece, and before trying it, split it in two to share with her father. It was a simple gesture, but Alejandro felt his heart soften. In the midst of the bustle, Leon approached and gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Now begins the hardest part," Leon told Alejandro. "Learning to be a father day by day." Alejandro smiled humbly. "I know, but this time I don't plan to run away." That night, back home, Isabella asked him to teach her a melody she had heard on the church organ. Alejandro opened Lucia's old piano, and together they began to practice. The notes came out clumsy, but in each chord breathed a beginning. The girl looked up, and with new confidence in her voice told him, "Dad, I'm not afraid anymore." Alejandro felt his eyes moisten. He hugged her, and with a broken but firm voice responded, "Your eyes have saved me, my daughter." The tower clock struck midnight. Outside, the festival lights went out little by little. But inside the mansion, for the first time in years, there was a clarity that nothing could extinguish. Alejandro knew there were still wounds to close, nights of nightmares, memories that would hurt. But he also knew he had chosen the right path, to live for his daughter, to repair what he had broken, and to honor Lucia's memory. The last flame of the candle on his wife's portrait flickered for an instant before going out, and in that silence, Alejandro understood the cycle was closed. From that night on, the Herrera house would no longer be a place of shadows, but a home where love had found a way to be reborn. Sometimes a single look is enough to tear down years of silence. In the mansion outside Boston, the reunion between Alejandro and Isabella wasn't a grand act, but a simple gesture, recognizing themselves in each other's eyes. What began as a house full of secrets ended up transforming into a home where love breathed again. And now, dear listener, if this story has reached your heart, I invite you to leave a 1 in the comments. And if you think we can still improve, mark a 0. The lesson it leaves us is clear. Money and power can never replace the warmth of a family. We can lose many things in life, but we should never give up the opportunity to love and be loved. Kindness, even in its smallest form, is capable of changing entire destinies. Just like a lamp lit in the window of an old house, a single act of tenderness can guide someone in the midst of darkness. We all deserve a place where we feel safe, a hug that reminds us we're not alone, and the certainty that it's always possible to start over. Perhaps you too have carried past mistakes or unresolved distances. This story reminds us it's never too late to repair what has been broken, to ask forgiveness, to extend a hand, to dedicate time. Simple gestures that build bridges stronger than any wealth. In the end, what remains are not the properties or contracts, but the people who choose to walk beside us. Take a moment now to think of someone close. Is there a word you haven't yet said? A hug you can still offer? Time is fragile, but when shared, it becomes eternal. If this narrative has touched some fiber of your memory, share it with someone dear. And if you wish to continue listening to stories where kindness defeats fear and family finds its strength, join us in the upcoming chapters as well. Because true wealth is not measured in numbers, but in the capacity to remain together, even when everything seems lost.